All right, might as well get started, and should somebody else show up, then I'll show up. All right, so we last left off with the 67 war, and looked like everything was going to be great for Israel from there on in. And yet, like the creature in a horror movie, the Arab League somehow came back. So in the wake of the Six-Day War, Israel found itself in a situation without peace, but it seemed to find security, right? And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But Israel had won this war in a tremendously successful low casualties war for Israel. They found themselves ruling over a huge amount of territory. They found themselves ruling over a huge amount of people. With the war's end militarily, the first thing that the Israelis had to do was deal with the subject populations in the West Bank and Gaza, which, look, it's one of those things which, I don't know at what point you are prepared for an occupation. Certainly the Israelis were not. This is not something that had been in their, wheelhouse, but, there they are. And it varied widely, right? There are places where the Palestinians were more or less subdued. There were places where violence begins, right? Fatah, which begins as in 1959 and doesn't really begin engaging in terrorist activities until about 1964. So is going to find. Fatah was already operating in the West Bank, right? So there already were Fatah cells from when it was Jordanian. So those were already existing. And the Israelis come down pretty hard in the years right after the 67 war. Right? There's a reason why the Palestinians are going to become fairly subdued until the late 1980s, because the Israelis subdued them. The Israelis also have to cope with a new type of warfare. Obviously, there had been raids in Israel before. There'd been the Fedayeen. But the 1970s really is the beginning of the age of a new type of terrorism, an international terrorism involving hijackings and attacks on Israelis overseas and so forth, which, again, things which Israel was not really, or nobody really was coping with beforehand, because it didn't really exist beforehand. And 1969 also saw something called the War of Attrition. So when Jews outside of Israel talk about Israel's wars, they've got 48, 56, 67, 73, Lebanon. Israelis also add to that something called the War of Attrition. So 1969, understand what had happened is that Israel had conquered almost all of Sinai, right? There's a tiny, tiny little piece of Sinai up here, which was still in Egyptian control at the end of the 67 war. But Israel controlled one half of Sinai, the Egyptians the other. And from 67 on, the Suez Canal, the Suez Canal, I should say, Suez Canal was closed. The Egyptians refused to open it, with the Israelis on the other side. So one of the points of the War of Attrition was Nasser's efforts to try and push the Israelis back from the Suez Canal. So the Egyptians would shell Israeli positions across the canal. It's only like a mile across the canal, so easy enough to do. The Israelis would respond by bombing and raiding Egyptian positions. And, as the name suggests, War of Attrition, Nasser's hope was that Israel would eventually tire of this, because again, they have far fewer people to lose, and would pull back away from the Suez Canal, which, whether or not Egypt occupied the canal would perhaps at least give him some ability to claim a victory. But, Israelis didn't do that. 1970, Nasser dies and the War of Attrition comes to an end. Now, both because of the War of Attrition and because of their own long-term goals, Israel erects a network of fortifications along the Suez Canal, known as the Bar-Lev Line, named after the defense minister at the time, Chaim Bar-Lev. This is not like the Maginot Line. This is not a continuous chain of fortifications. Rather, the idea is that the Israelis are going to build a network of fixed emplacements along the canal, which will allow Israelis to observe the canal, to control canal crossings. In a best case scenario, the presence of these Israeli soldiers would prevent a canal crossing. In the worst case scenario, if the Egyptians did cross the canal, the presence of these fortresses would require the Egyptians to take them down, and that would delay them, which would give the Israelis time to bring up more of their forces. So a lot of money spent on the Bar-Lev line fortresses. You can see over here how they run. None of them are particularly big. Each one has a few dozen soldiers there. And ultimately in the war, a little spoiler, they're not going to prove particularly effective. And as much as the Bar-Lev line cost, it cost less than the hubris that Israel operated under. The 67 war was the victory was so phenomenal that a lot of Israelis and people in Israeli military who should have known better drew a lot of very bad conclusions. In their view, 67 had proven that the Arabs simply can't fight. And that Israel really has nothing to fear from them. In 6 days, they destroyed the armed forces of 3 neighboring powers, some of them relatively powerful. And we have here a quote from Moshe Dayan. It is a weakness that derives from factors. At this point, he's the Israeli defense minister. It is a weakness that derives from factors that I don't believe will change quickly. The low level of their soldiers in education, technology, and integrity, inter-Arab divisiveness, which is papered over from time to time, but superficially and for short spans, And you'd find this thought throughout Israeli intelligence and military circles, that the Arabs simply, and I use the Arab here in the term context way that the Israelis would use, the Arab collectively is simply not able to win a war against Israel, They lack the morale, they lack the courage, they lack the ability to coordinate these kinds of attacks, and the planning abilities, whatever it may be. And this is going to lead to some really dangerous assumptions. Israeli intelligence accepted what came to be called the concept, which had a few elements, but the basic notion is the Arabs would not attack Israel because the Arabs knew they couldn't win, The lesson from the part of Israel was, since the Arabs can't, number one, the Arabs can't win, so there's no point in them ever bothering to attack us. We have nothing to worry about. And if we add some other details, Syria would not attack without Egypt. Egypt would not attack without long-distance bombers and Scud missiles, The assumption is that the Egyptians would not attack Israel unless they had certain weapons which allowed them to threaten Israeli air bases and Israeli cities. And Israel would have at least 48 hours notice before an Egyptian attack, So, and of course, the Egyptians wouldn't attack, Because they'd have nothing to gain in the view of some of these intelligence personnel. So, for several years, the Israelis therefore operate in this tremendous sense of comfort, security, We have nothing to worry about from the Arabs, and each of these takes on sort of a level, is like a religious truth. This has now become a law of science. This is what the Arabs can do. This is what they can't do. We have nothing to worry about. And as you'll see in 73, a whole lot of this stuff is proven to be false. So, as I said, in September 1970, Nasser died and was succeeded by his close confidant, Anwar Sadat. Now, a lot of people did not view Sadat particularly. Look, Nasser had dominated Egyptian politics since 1952. He had dominated, to a great extent, inter-Arab or pan-Arab politics since the mid-1950s. Nasser was a giant, and Sadat was just sort of a shadow, or actually even in his shadow. And a lot of people figure, fine, Sadat will take over until somebody else more impressive takes over. But Sadat has big plans for Egypt. He wants to build Egypt's economy. He wants to change Egypt's place in the world. But to do this, he needs American money. He needs American know-how. He needs American support and relationship with the West. But he also needs the support of the Egyptians, So to get American support, it's going to mean a shifting of Egypt away from being a Soviet, satellite to, affiliating itself with the United States. But in order to get sort of the ability to move this way, to shift to America, to make big changes, he needs the support of the Egyptians, who again don't see him as a necessarily an impressive figure. And in order to get the support of the Egyptians, he needs a victory over the Israelis, some kind of victory over the Israelis. And for the next year, Sadat makes peace overtures, right? This is one of those things where, did Israel miss an opportunity? Certainly Sadat's offers left something to be desired, right? He called for Israel to give up claims on all the land he took in 67 in exchange for some sort of normalization that would fall short of peace, like some kind of okay, we recognize you exist, but that's as far as we'll go. And the Israelis don't really bite for any of this stuff. They're not willing to negotiate on those terms because, again, the Israelis don't feel that they have anything to fear from the Arabs. But the fact that Sadat was not entirely sincere about this either. Right? Sadat is making these gestures because he's making a pitch sort of to the Americans to say, hey, look, I'm a reasonable guy. I'm willing to play ball with the Israelis. But Sadat understood he needed his own victory. And it's kind of telling here. This is from his widow, Jahan, in 1987. Sadat needed one more war in order to win and enter into negotiations from a position of equality, right? That although Sadat's saying he's willing to talk to the Israelis, in real terms, he doesn't want to do that until after he's achieved some kind of military success against Israel. Otherwise, he would appear to the Egyptians and perhaps appear to himself as a beggar, right? Going to the Israelis and saying, okay, you won. Right? What can we get back? Right? He wanted to be able to negotiate from a position of respect and strength. He had declared 1971 to be the year of decisions. There had been buildups and blustering, but nothing came of it. And Israel concluded that Sadat was basically a paper tiger, right? 71 was a year that, again, Sadat had hoped to do something, didn't happen. The Israelis, again, just figured out that Sadat's just talking, again, blustering. And Sadat himself sort of concluded that he couldn't afford another humiliation like that. And the Egyptians spent the next few years building up their military, most problematically for Israel, a deep network of advanced surface-to-air missiles, particularly the SAM-6, which is located over here. So, this is something that Israel hadn't really had to cope with in 67. But Israel found that they did not yet have a way to cope with these SAMs yet. So, Israel had previously been able to sort of fly without real problems over Egypt and bomb things when they wanted to. These surface-to-air missiles make that difficult. And Israel is coming to understand that, even if they decide to launch a first strike against Egypt like they did in 67, it's not going to be as easy as it was in 67, right? The Egyptians have built a really extensive network of these missile bases all along the Suez Canal. Moreover, the SAM umbrella would provide cover not only for Egypt's buildup, right? So Egypt can do a lot now without Israel being able to overfly, but from the Egyptian perspective, right, having this SAM umbrella is going to allow them to cross the canal without the kind of worries about Israeli airstrikes that they would have had to worry about before, right? Which gives, again, the Egyptians that sort of incentive or courage to say, we can do this. And the Israelis themselves didn't think that the Egyptians had the know-how, had the skill, had the audacity to make that happen. And when we get to October 6, 1973, and the Israelis' failures to predict what was going to happen, lots of blame to go around, right? There's a lot of people who made mistakes. Probably the most important figure is Eli Zera, who's head of Amman, which is Israeli military intelligence. So, to a great extent, people know about the Mossad, but military intelligence was kind of like the last step for a lot of this stuff, right? They absorb a lot of intelligence. They're the ones who have to actually, decide on like what the military knows or plans to do. So although, not as famous as Mossad, because it's not doing the kind of international executions or assassinations and stuff that people associate with, Amman is extremely important. And he was a real devotee of the concept. And he had demonstrated his own sort of mastery of of this stuff back in May '73. There'd been an Egyptian buildup along the canal. A number of intelligence sources were pointing to an Israeli attack, sorry, to an Egyptian attack. Meir and Dayan were talking about mobilizing back in May. Zera told him, nope, not going to be any attack. I got my own special sources. He was right. Even though Israel's best placed source with the Egyptians, which they called the source, we'll speak more about him later, said that war is imminent. Zera said it wasn't. And when the Egyptians pulled back from the brink, Zera's stock soared. He's the guy who stood calm when everybody else was saying there was going to be a war. But even there, people did not notice some of the things that they might have taken away. The Egyptians pulled back from the canal, but they left a lot of equipment in place, meaning that next time they decided to have another sort of attack, it wouldn't necessarily require the kind of effort and buildup that they'd seen before. What allowed Zera to be so certain in May was that, aside from the fact that he claimed to have a really great understanding of the Arab psyche and so forth, and the limitations, was access to something the Israelis called special means. That Israel had managed to install these sort of listening devices, I guess taps on the phone lines in Egyptian army headquarters, which allowed them to, and not just on phone lines, but they had something in the phones that allowed them to hear what was going on in the headquarters. And so when everybody else is saying, oh, it looks like there's an attack coming, Zera's able to tap into the actual discussions taking place among high-ranking Egyptian military figures and could say, no, there's no attack, right? He's actually heard this, right, firsthand. So the Israelis definitely had some important resources. But in late September, the Egyptians begin another major buildup along the canal. They claim they're just doing this for military exercises, but historically, right, that's the sort of thing where once you've got all your troops there for military exercise, you can also do whatever you want to them in terms of a conventional war. And a lot of observers on the ground, a lot of the soldiers stationed in Sinai are beginning to report things that they haven't seen before, right? They're seeing new types of troops, on the part of the Egyptians. They're seeing a lot more evidence of Egyptian reconnaissance patrols in Israeli territory, right? The Egyptians are coming across the canal and patrolling around and setting things up. So a lot of information is starting to come in, pointing to the potential of an Egyptian attack. And the same sort of stuff is taking place in the Golan. Syrian troops are massing on the border. Syrian surface-to-air missiles, which normally might have been back protecting Damascus, are now being moved to the front. And Syrian army units, which were normally kept in the rear and which Israeli intelligence had suggested would be moved to the front only if there were an imminent attack, are starting to be seen. So there's a lot of stuff coming in. But Zera didn't worry about it because as far as Zera is concerned, he knew, based on intelligence, that Syria wouldn't go to war without Egypt. Egypt wouldn't go to war without Scuds and long-range bombers, which the Soviets weren't giving them. Of course, even if they did decide to go to war, the Israelis would have noticed beforehand, right? Again, the concept was very strongly in place, even as some extremely compelling evidence comes in. King Hussein of Jordan had a meeting with Golda Meir in September and gave her in person a warning that Egypt and Syria were planning an attack. Again, Zaire just says, no, nothing to worry about. And with Yom Kippur coming up and a whole lot of evidence pointing to an attack taking place, there is some call for a mobilization, even a partial one. The government is leery about that sort of thing. Again, it's a risky thing to do politically to mobilize on Yom Kippur if it's a false alarm. And a lot of the people in the Israeli government, in Israeli intelligence, in Israeli military, thought, well, listen, we know that Zera has access to this special means. if war were imminent, he'd pick something up. And so when Zara tells them to calm down, they assume that he was telling them that based on the kind of inside information which they had access to. What they didn't realize, however, is that Zara hadn't tapped into special means. One of the sets that they'd had already been uncovered before, Zara didn't want to risk the other one being exposed, because again, he felt that a war was not imminent. So, why risk the Egyptians finding this material when, just be waste anyway? So he hadn't activated his, best sort of intelligence asset. And so he was just basing this on his sort of assumptions. Then on the 5th, Avi Zamir, who's head of the Mossad, is called to London to meet with the source, right? Now, the source was revealed in the early 21st century, a guy named Ashraf Marwan, who is a son-in-law of this guy was extremely well placed. Marwan was later on is going to be a billionaire at this point. He's sort of a young man with expensive tastes, living in London with his wife, right, one of Nasser's daughters. He liked the high life. That took more money than he had access to. And it seems early on he had offered to sell his services to the Israelis, and had been giving them really very important intelligence. He'd given them the battle plans for the Egyptian army, the order of battle, right, so that the Israelis knew what the Egyptians were planning to do and what troops they'd use, what you'd expect to see. He was the one who had told them that war was coming back in May, which again proved wrong there, but reasonable that perhaps he had some good information there. And he's now telling them that war is going to break out on October 6th, which is Yom Kippur, right? The night of the 5th is Erev Yom Kippur. Says that not only is it going to break out, he gives it the time, 6 p.m. Zamir is convinced by this. Again, he decides not to fly back to Israel to tell people, but to call back and let them know on the night of the 5th that there's going to be an attack the next day. And the Israelis begin making plans for mobilization. But even then, there's a lot of uncertainty as to how exactly to proceed, right? There's not good communication between various segments of the Israeli military over this. So even with this, it is taking longer time than it should. And again, they're operating on the premise that that 6 p.m. is when the attack's going to take place. Contrary to popular misconception, Golda Meir did not refuse to launch a preemptive strike in order to avoid American disapproval. She was concerned about the prospect of launching an attack unless there's really going to be a war, because she didn't want to upset Americans. That's really true. By October 6th, though, she was convinced that it was time to strike because the war is happening, and she would explain it to the Americans and give them the intelligence they had. And an airstrike at Syrian positions was actually approved, right? So the Israelis actually were moving forward on a preemptive strike on the Golan, or on the Syrians across the Golan. Two problems. One was that there's heavy cloud cover over the Golan, and it wouldn't be until the 1 p.m. that they could launch this strike, which might have been fine, except that Marwan was wrong. The attack was actually set for 2 p.m. And there has been some speculation that Marwan was a double agent. This is something that was pushed by Zahira because he wanted to make it seem this, wasn't his fault. But the truth seems a bit more mundane, right? Because that would also put the blame on the Mossad because he was their asset. The attack actually had been planned for 6 p.m. Basically, the Syrians had wanted to attack at 7 a.m. Because they wanted to have as much light as possible for their attack. The Egyptians had wanted to attack at 6 p.m. because they were going to have to cross the Suez Canal, and they wanted darkness for that. At Assad's pleading, they agreed on a compromise. The attack would start at 2 p.m. So by the time the attack came, the Israelis were just sort of beginning to go through their mobilization, right? They'd wasted valuable hours, but they thought they still had 4 more hours to go. And they also thought that the Israeli forces that they actually had already on the location would be sufficient to deal with the Arabs until Israeli reserves were called up. But October 6th, 2 p.m., both the Egyptians and the Syrians are going to launch major assaults on Israeli positions. And the fact is, the Egyptians have been planning this for years, and their planning and training paid off, right? This picture is interesting. The Israelis had built, and both sides had built them big sand berms along the canal, which would make it difficult to assault. The Egyptians came up with sort of the high power hoses, which would dissolve the sand and allow tanks and things to go through. The Egyptians launch a massive artillery barrage on the Bar Lev forts, and there's virtually no Israeli response. And when the Israelis do respond, they expect this is going to run like it did in 67 and in 56. Israelis are going to surge forward. The Egyptians will panic, right? There's actually a term for this in German going back to World War I, Panzerschreck, Panzer terror, which is later on used for a German anti-tank weapon, right? The terror that soldiers felt when they were under assault by tanks. And, in basic training, we would have to, at one point, we would go into a foxhole and a tank rolled over the position because they wanted us to be in the experience of having a tank roll over us, basically to prepare us for this sort of thing. So the Israelis expected that they would do this just like they did in 67. They'd launch an armored assault. The Egyptians would break, end of the war. What they weren't counting on is the Egyptians had a devastating new weapon, the Stagger anti-tank missile. So this is a small device. They actually came in these sort of little suitcases. So a man could carry one. The Egyptians had these little carts that they carried them on. It is a wire-guided missile system with a range of 3,000 meters, which is long, right? Longer than the range of most tank guns at the time. And again, you could fight at that distance, but that's a long way to go. So the Israeli tanks are coming forward, looking for enemy soldiers, and small tank hunter kills or tank killer teams would be hiding in the sand, pop up, fire these missiles, at thousands of these missiles, and suddenly the Israelis find themselves with their being blown out of their tanks and their tanks disabled from people they couldn't even see. In addition to the Saggers, they also had these RPG-7s, which were rocket-propelled grenade anti-tank things, which again had thousands of them. So the early Israeli assaults, which the Israelis counted on to blunt any sort of Egyptian attack in time for the reserves to come up, were a disaster. And the Israelis lose dozens of tanks. And the Egyptians themselves were not fighting like the Egyptians in the past. And it should be noted that in both 56 and 67, the IDF really didn't see, let's say, what the Egyptians might have done if they hadn't been ordered to withdraw. In 56, they were ordered to withdraw because of the British attack on the canal. In 67, they were ordered to withdraw by a mayor, the Minister of Defense, who again panicked. And so, a lot of what the Israelis thought that the Egyptians were predicated to some extent on these special situations. And they certainly didn't expect what would happen if the Egyptians had been trained properly, if they had new equipment, if they had a well-executed, well-laid-out plan, and if they could do all of this under the safety of a surface-to-air missile umbrella, which rendered the IAF, the Israeli Air Force, out of action, right, for the day. And it's not just down in Egypt, right? Similar surprises faced the Israelis in the Golan. The Syrians also launched a massive armored assault combined with select commando raids, like the one on Mount Hermon. So Mount Hermon is a mountain. I think it's the highest point in Israel, far up here. And from Mount Hermon, the Israelis had a good observation point and intelligence post that allowed them to see pretty much the whole Golan and the Egyptian positions. And they lost that in the first hours of the attack to a Syrian commando raid. And the Israelis find themselves in a position they weren't prepared for. Israeli military doctrine is built on the offensive, right? They would attack first, they would control the flow of battle, and they would win with their own tactics and their own abilities. They hadn't really prepared for a defensive war, certainly not like this. And Israeli generals, Israeli tactics were not caught up to this. And understand the mobilization had started before the war began. But number one, less than a day before the war began, and the Israelis had assumed they'd have at least 48 hours to prepare. And the Israelis had also assumed that Israeli forces in the West, in Jordan, not Jordan, in the Golan and in the Sinai would be sufficient to cope with the Arabs until the reserves could come up. Not only did that prove false, right? Both of those proved false, right? They had much less time. The Israeli army on duty wasn't able to cope with what they faced. And mobilization is you have to get all the soldiers to the places they have to go. They have to take their weapons out of storage. Again, in many cases, saying, oh, we got to get a tank. That tank has had various pieces taken off of it. Those pieces have to be reassembled. Tankers are getting tanks and going into battle without the tanks themselves having all the weapons and supplies and gun sight and so forth they need to. And the Israelis are desperate at this point. They're not even forming whole units. They're just throwing in whatever they have available because the conditions are so drastic. As the war moved from Saturday to Sunday, the Israelis in particular are worried about Syria, right? Sinai gave the Israelis defense in depth, right? They had strategic depth in Sinai. If they lost, right, 20 kilometers of Sinai, they have another, 130 kilometers. But if they lose the Golan, the next stop is the Galilee. So Israelis decide, you know what? Sorry, soldiers stuck in the Bar-Lev line, because again, there are hundreds of Israeli soldiers stuck along the canal line. Israel needed to throw everything they had at that point against the Syrians. And it's not working at first, right? The first day sees the Syrians taking big chunks of the Golan Heights. They're moving closer to the end of the Golan where they could threaten then the Galilee. Moshe Dayan and some of the other prominent Israeli military figures had grown up in the Galilee. Dayan was from Degania, which is one of the first kibbutzim. And by Sunday evening, Dayan is talking about nuclear weapons. Right? He says that the third temple has fallen. He proposes to Golda Meir perhaps that there be some sort of nuclear display over the desert or something like that to show that Israel has nuclear weapons. He's talked down from it, but it does give some indication of how panicked some of the great generals Israel had and the most informed people were. By the 8th, though, right, so the initial attack was on the 6th, Israel's counterattacking in Sinai. But again, a failure, right? The Israelis still did not anticipate how well the Egyptians would fight there and how different this war would be. But the heaviest fighting in the first few days is going to be in Syria, which again was the far more critical front. And in those first few days, sometimes about all that stood between the Syrians and the Galilee seemed to be really just small numbers of Israeli tankers, right? And here are some of the Tzvika Greenberg was actually, again, he was in a tank commander school when the war broke out. So he's not even attached to a particular unit. He leaves the school, the training course. He goes to Golan, reports to the main army base there, says, listen, give me a tank. I'll fight it. He gets a tank, he gets a crew. So this isn't like his tank, but it's what he's given. And for the next 20 hours, he basically spends, again, 20 hours awake, moving from place to place, destroying Syrian tanks, rallying Israeli tanks. He has several tanks shot out from underneath him. He swaps to other ones, loses crew members, gets other ones. He is so afraid that the Syrians will find out that sometimes he's just fighting alone, that he just won't even say on the radio how many men he has or how many tanks he has, because the Syrians actually think he's got a larger force because he's moving around so much, right? Not realizing that Svika force, or whatever they were calling it on the radio, was sometimes just one guy. Similarly is the story of Avigdor Kahalani, well-known figure in Israeli military history. For about 50 hours, he leads a small force of several dozen tanks against a Syrian assault of about 500 tanks. This is the last prepared fighting position before the Galilee. So the Israelis had set up these fighting positions, which basically, if you look over here at a tank, the less of your tank you have exposed, the better, right? Tanks have heavy armor in the front, right? So if you expose the front, not better there. So what the Israelis do is and you can kind of see here, this is going to go on. They would make an elevated position, sort of a berm over here, which would allow a tank to be on sort of an incline and reach a level where it essentially was just exposing, right, the barest top of the tank itself, right, while giving it, you can sort of see here, full range to target anything coming along these planes. Sorry. So the Israelis had these positions. And basically, the Paolani and his men take up these fighting positions. There's a huge plain full of Syrian tanks and armored personnel carriers moving towards this position. They fought the Syrians through the night of the 7th. They fight them through the 8th. Right on the morning of the 9th, there's a massive Syrian artillery barrage, and the tanks are forced to withdraw. At which point he only has really a handful of these tanks left, about a dozen out of the 40 he started with. And the men are shell-shocked. The men have been through, again, at this point, for some of them, 2 days of constant fighting, or nearly 2 days of constant fighting. But they know that the Syrians are trying to reach these fighting positions. And once the Syrians get over those positions, there's basically nothing between them and the Galilee, right? That's the last thing holding them back. And they can see Syrian tanks cresting the positions. Paolani destroys some of those tanks. He tries to rally the other Israeli tanks to join him with great difficulty, because again, the men are so worn out by this. He finally manages to get them back onto the hill. And again, for the next few hours, this handful of tanks manages to ward off this Syrian attack. And by the time they're done, the Syrians have broken. Of the 40 tanks he'd started with, only 7 are left. And in that field, that plain, this is not the actual site, or maybe it is, it's called the Valley of Tears. In the plain and the Valley of Tears, the Syrians left behind 260 tanks and a similar number of armored personnel carriers, right? I mean, Kahalani is seen and was told by commanders at the time that he was basically the guy who saved Israel, because after him, there is nothing. And both these men win Israel's highest honor, the Otak Vorah, which is the equivalent of the Medal of Honor for them. And the fact is, it is worth pointing out here that while the Israelis were taken by surprise in a number of ways, ultimately the Israeli soldiers did fight better than the Arab opponents did, right? The Arabs fought bravely, right? Some of the Arabs fought very well, but in many cases, they just moved forward. They weren't particularly good at adapting to changes in the situation. And one of the things that takes place over this week is that the Israelis learn very quickly, right? Israeli tankers figure out how to avoid these Stagger missiles, which again move slowly and can be detected. Israeli pilots figure out tactics to deal with the surface-to-air missiles, and Israeli tankers, when they actually engage enemy tanks, are destroying them at a much higher rate, right? The Israeli assumption, the commander's assumptions that a few hundred Israeli tanks could hold back 1,000 Arab tanks wasn't necessarily off base. Had some of these other things come into play. And the fact is that there are two other things that the Israelis benefited from here. One is that the Arab leadership, Arab generals, and a lot of Arab soldiers, to some extent, couldn't believe that the attack was going as well as it was. Right. So what you see with the Egyptians is they advance a few kilometers into the Sinai, and then they stop. Right. They stop under the air umbrella of their surface-to-air missiles. They stop within their artillery range and so forth. And part of this is because, right, some of the commanders assumed that the Israelis must have a trap. Right. This is all going so well. There must be something else they're planning. And even when we talk about Zvika Greenberg, right, the fact that the Egyptians the Syrians assumed there must be a larger force, because they assumed the Israelis couldn't just have a handful of men, right, left to deal with this stuff. And because both the Egyptians and the Syrians had tremendous respect for Israeli military ability, even though both talked about joining together to destroy Israel, the reality is both the Syrians and the Egyptians, rhetoric notwithstanding, had far more limited goals. Egypt wanted to reclaim part of the Sinai. I mean, if they could get the whole Sinai, great. They didn't think they could. But Sadat wanted to take enough of the Sinai that he could claim to hold Israeli territory and to claim a victory. But he wasn't really planning to destroy Israel, or even advance past the Sinai. And Assad, by the same token, Assad wanted to take the Golan. Didn't really think they could do much beyond that. And you have this sort of therefore awkward relationship between the Arabs. And on that, Diane was right. The fact is, for all the talk of Arab cooperation, in this case, both the Egyptians and the Syrians saw themselves as using the other. Right, the Egyptians thinking, Syria will keep the Israelis occupied in the Golan, which will allow us to hold what we need. The Syrians thinking, all right, great. The Egyptians will keep the Israelis occupied in Sinai, which will allow us to take what we want. But both the Egyptians and the Syrians assumed that they would grab what they could and then call for a ceasefire. Right. In fact, the Syrians had spoken to the Soviets beforehand to suggest, look, we're going to attack Israel. The Soviets disapproved because they thought the Egyptians and the Syrians would lose badly. But be prepared within 48 hours to call for a ceasefire, because what the Syrians assumed is 48 hours would give them a chance to take the Golan, while the Israelis were occupied on both fronts. A ceasefire would be called, and they would end the war back in control of their territory. But after the assault broke on the 9th, the Syrians begin withdrawing. The Israelis launch a counteroffensive that's going to take them within 15 miles of Damascus. Around that same time, Iraqi reinforcements have been rushed from Iraq into Syria, which, when the Israelis encounter them, they decide, okay, we were prepared to chase the Syrians back to wherever. We're not ready to face a fresh army. But by the 10th, basically, so 4 days after the war started, the Israelis have reconquered almost all of the Golan and a chunk of Syrian territory, right, seen up there, and have launched artillery shells at the airport outside of Damascus. And while all this is going on, the Arabs and the Israelis turn to their respective superpower patrons. Now, Moscow had originally opposed the decision to go to war. They thought it'd be another humiliating defeat for their clients. But as the first reports came in from the front, they thought, oh, the Arabs are doing well, right? We should support this. And so they see this as an opportunity to show the power of Soviet arms and Soviet doctrine, although the Egyptians had kicked out their own Soviet advisors. They still obviously received a lot of training from the Soviets. And so the Soviets are backing their Arab clients. They're sending more supplies as needed. And the Americans, sorry, the Israelis turned to the Americans. Now, the U.S., like the Soviets and like the Israelis, have originally been confident in a swift Israeli victory. And when the truth becomes clear, though, that Israel is actually losing a lot, um, you know, the Israelis beg the Americans for support. And Kissinger sees a need to give it to them. And again, timing matters. And in the same way that in 67, with the US fighting in Vietnam, it wasn't particularly interested in getting involved in the Middle East. In 73, with the US having just left Vietnam, the United States really feels that they have to make a show of supporting a democratic ally in the region. If they want to maintain a global, look, if they want to maintain credibility where there are other clients, they need to show they're there. And I think to some extent, it's similar to what happened with Joe Biden and Ukraine, right? I mean, after leaving Afghanistan, the U.S. was looking weak and humiliated and needed to really make a stand in Ukraine, perhaps more than we might otherwise have done so, to send a message. So Israel is going to be the beneficiary of that, right? As far as Kissinger is concerned, this isn't about Israel and the Arabs anymore. This is about the United States and the Soviet Union and, right, the Cold War. And that means America needs to back Israel, right, regardless of what concerns they might have about Israeli, expansionism. He had also started, though, receive interesting word from Egypt. The Egyptians assured the Americans they would not expand the conflict, meaning that unlike in 56, unlike in 67, where Nasser made this, well, let's look at 67, made this about America, right? In 67, Nasser's rhetoric was all about how the Americans are aiding the Israelis, the Americans are behind all of this. Saddam makes it clear he is not blaming America. He's not going to try and entangle America. And that if America doesn't get involved, he won't go any further. So the Americans have been looking at Sadat and thinking maybe this guy is somebody we can try and do some work with, which we'll see. And in fact, after Israel drove the Syrians out of the Golan and expressed interest in a ceasefire, it's actually Kissinger who wants them to keep fighting the Sinai, right? Kissinger becomes, in some respects, more hawkish than the Israelis, right? The Israelis, at least some of them, are saying we need to stop, we need to reconfigure. Kissinger is concerned that if Israel doesn't end the war, having crossed the Suez Canal, this will look like a Israeli loss, which of course will look like an American loss. So Kissinger is telling the Israelis, we're going to try and delay a ceasefire until, right, you guys are ready. The Soviets begin making noise as the Israelis move towards Damascus. Israeli bombing mission actually killed some Soviets in a bombing raid. The Soviets begin mobilizing airborne divisions and talking about need to intervene. The Americans make it clear that the U.S. is prepared to intervene in Israel's behalf, right? If the Soviets are going to send troops in there, the U.S. will as well. And with Syria in check, the Israelis can begin contemplating crossing the canal. This would cut off the Egyptians. They could threaten Cairo, could force a withdrawal. It's a risky move. Not only might the IDF troops themselves get cut off, right? I mean, so if the idea is they could cross the canal, but then their bridgeheads get destroyed, they could end up being trapped instead of the Egyptians. But also, Egypt still had fresh armored divisions in the West Bank of the canal. So Israeli military planners don't see any option here. They have to cross the canal, both to threaten the Egyptians, but also to win a, let's say, strategic victory when it comes to negotiating at the end of the war. Ariel Sharon, who was commanding a division, armored division in the desert at the time, was all for this, right? He had figured out a place where this could be done. But making it happen is something else. Now, the Israelis knew from the battle plan that the source had given them that those armored formations were supposed to cross the canal at some point when the Egyptians were prepared to break out through the Sinai. They weren't sure if those plans are still in effect, but they decided one way or the other they're going to do it. Sharon, again, had found a place to make this happen. There was an area like right around here where basically the Egyptian Second Army is supposed to link with the Third Army, but there's a small gap. They figured, okay, we can go right between that point, right, cross the canal. And Sharon was Israel's most gung-ho commander. He's one of their best commanders, but he was also viewed as a very political general. He had actually left the army, joined the Likud, was in the Knesset when he came back because of the war. He'd always been a general or commander before he's a general who sought, personal glory. And who also had a very liberal view of following orders. Both here and in other circumstances, he's often willing to go beyond what his directions are, both for himself and for the state and so forth. By Saturday the 13th, massive American resupply starts coming in. So even from the start of the war, the Americans had been providing the Israelis with supplies, but only how it could be carried on El Al planes. When the Israelis came a few days earlier to say we're really desperate, and Kissinger gave the okay, the United States begins a massive air and sea lift. C-5 Galaxies, which are the biggest transport planes the U.S. had, are carrying armor directly from American bases in Germany. Right, they're going all out on this. New planes, new armor, new anti-tank missiles, right, the whole 9 yards, whatever the Israelis are asking for. And on the 13th, the Mossad receives intelligence the Egyptian tanks were crossing the canal and an offensive was about to start, right? That the Egyptians are now moving outside of their SAM umbrella, the surface to air missile umbrella. And the feeling seems to be that Sadat is pushing for this because he's afraid that if he doesn't advance into the Sinai, that Syria is about to leave the war, right? Because they're in a much worse position. And if Syria leaves the war, then the whole Israeli military can turn to Egypt, and that's not going to be good for Sadat. So going against the advice of his generals who had masterminded the crossing, Sadat orders the Egyptians to go forward. And this is what the Israelis have been dreaming about since the start of the war: a big open tank battle, right, in the desert. And it goes the way the Israelis planned. They smash the Egyptians, bruising defeat. The Egyptians fall back to their previous positions, and the Israelis actually worried that they were too successful, because they want another few more days of this kind of warfare, to the extent that the chief of staff has a sort of staged conversation with the Southern commander on the radio, talking about how badly Israel did and how bruised they were, in the hopes of trying to coax the Egyptians to attack the next day, which the Egyptians didn't. There are a couple other amusing radio communication anecdotes. So in Syria, one of the first signs the Israelis had that the Iraqis had entered the war was that an Israeli radio operator heard Arabs talking on the radio, and he'd come from Iraq himself, and he recognized the accent of the people speaking, that they were actually Iraqis and not Syrians. And in Sinai, one Israeli officer who knew that there were Hebrew-speaking intelligence officers who were monitoring his reports would switch to Yiddish periodically when he wanted to say things that he didn't want the Arabs to understand. Right? Don't know how successful he was, but interesting thing anyway. At any rate, with the Egyptians having sent over their armored forces, the Israelis begin to push to and across the canal. So crossing the canal was going to require specialized equipment. The Israelis did not have great equipment for this, but they put together a variety of things that they acquired over the course of time: bridging equipment, floating pontoons, big floats that could carry men and tanks and so forth. It was a bloody few days as the Israelis tried to make their way there. And the first crossings brought over only small forces. But the Israelis begin to raid surface-to-air missile sites. They begin to attack supply convoys and so forth. And for a couple of days, the Egyptians don't even realize there's an Israeli force across the canal, right? They're hearing reports of this stuff. They think it's just the kind of panicking that you had in '67. They think, oh, it's probably just a few tanks and a few men and so forth. But gradually Sharon is building up the support there. And by the time the Egyptians realize that there is actually a significant Israeli force that's crossed the canal, the Israelis are now prepared to break out both north and south, and to again begin moving down towards threatening Cairo and cutting off the supplies of the Egyptian Third Army. Right. So if you look at this map over here, you can see the Israelis again swooping down this way, which would cut off the Third Army there. For both the Soviets and Americans, this was a good as time as any to end the war. For the Soviets, the war had shown both the quality of Soviet arms and the hazards of ignoring Soviet device. Or the Soviets could show to the rest of the world, look, Soviet weapons dealt the Israelis a terrible blow, but you know what? If you're going to go to war without following actual Soviet doctrine and directive and how to fight, bad things happen. They also assumed that when the war was over, the Egyptians would, as they had in '67, come to them begging for more weapons, and they would again have more leverage over them. For the Americans, the war ends now, or it seems to end with Israel having restored its prestige, demonstrated the power of deterrence, demonstrated the superiority of American weapons, and the Americans had demonstrated that it could be relied on, right? That when an ally was in need, the U.S. was there. And the Americans saw the Egyptians as showing an interest in turning to the U.S., right? And Kissinger, again, was understanding that if the Egyptians could end the war with some claim to victory, right, they would be much more willing to talk peace. The Egyptians were willing to end the war immediately. Sadat notified Assad that Egypt was accepting a ceasefire. Assad, who was in a much worse position, right? Sadat still had troops in the Suez. He could claim some sort of victory, even though there were Israelis across the canal. Assad just ended up, having lost more territory and having the Israelis threatening Damascus. Ceasefire goes into Southern Front more or less on October 22nd, though it's really not going to end. It's going to be called for the 22nd. The Israelis are going to try and grab some more territory. It's not really going to go into effect until the 25th. The Israelis are trying to further seal off the Third Army. The Syrians planned an attack on the 23rd, but eventually decided that there was no real chance of success, and they couldn't afford the losses. For their part, the Israelis were still trying to grab some territory, including Suez City. And the Soviets once again begin making moves towards intervening. There are reports of units in the Warsaw Pact being moved to airports, of Soviet airborne troops being loaded onto planes. Both the Soviet and American fleets are making their way through the Mediterranean to the Middle East. The 82nd Airborne Division is put on alert. And Kissinger and Nixon and Brezhnev have some pretty intense conversations about this. There had been a détente beforehand. Nixon assumes that the Soviets need it more than the Americans do. And eventually both sides sort of realize the need to calm down and pull back from this. And hold on, there's a knock at the door. Hold on. Sorry. I'm sorry. Okay, all good, just a delivery. Basically the Israelis were trying to force the Third Army to surrender by cutting off their supplies. Kissinger does not feel that that's going to be useful for his long-term goals. And so the Americans pressured the Israelis to allow the Third Army to receive food and other provisions. And so by the time the final agreement, sort of ending the conflict, is made in December, Sadat could claim that he'd achieved what no other Arab leader, including, of course, Nasser, had achieved. That he had ended a war with Israel with Egyptian forces occupying Israeli territory. Right? Didn't matter that Israeli territory used to be Egyptian territory. Didn't matter that Israel actually was occupying more Egyptian territory on the west side of the canal than Egypt was occupying on the east side of the canal. For an Arab public, and particularly an Egyptian public, which was starved for anything even remotely resembling a victory against Israel, this was huge, right? And he could sell himself to the Egyptian people as the man who had delivered a victory against Israel, and that he could now negotiate with Israel as equals, right? He could now go and approach the Israelis and approach his own people and sell them a victor's peace. As for the Israelis, the war was a huge blow, not just in terms of casualties, but to the country's psyche, right? In the same way that 67 had sort of made the Israelis feel that they were people who could accomplish anything. 73 made them feel that that they couldn't trust their leaders anymore, that perhaps they themselves were not the superstars they imagined them to be. But out of this loss came a sense that they needed to make peace, right? That if they wanted that maybe security without peace wasn't real security, or couldn't bring them enough security, that they couldn't rely just on the Israeli military, that the cost of relying just on the Israeli military was too great. And just as the Egyptians can now felt powerful enough to make peace, the Israelis felt vulnerable enough to make peace. But as we shall see next week, peace and security with Egypt would open up new possibilities for Israel for military conflict elsewhere. And with that, I am done. And if anybody has any questions, comments, concerns? Is anybody there?
Thank you very much.
Okay, then have a good night and pleasant dreams and so forth and so forth. Yeah, bye.
Bye.